So welcome everyone to Living a Spiritually Centered and Self-Actualized Life. I'm John Mark Shaw. Good to see you all back. And today I wanted to start and talk about letting go of the past and how we can free ourselves from the limiting stories of our lives. And I wanted to go over some things we spoke about last week, which is about seeing our lives through the loving eyes of wholeness, and about learning to really say yes to what comes to us in our lives, to really start to trust and allow that what's coming to us is for us instead of happening to us, that through the unfolding of our lives and through the challenges that arise in our lives, that we start to grow, and instead of resisting the change and the challenges, to start seeing the change and the challenge as the energy of becoming, as the energy of our growth, as the energy of our self-actualization, and that our challenges really are pushing us to release old stories, old pain, old fears, old self-definitions and limiting beliefs about ourselves, so that if we can face those challenges with an open heart and allow them to change us, to open us, and to release those challenges, to release those memories, to release that pain, to release the small limiting stories about our lives, we can start to grow. And that through this process we can start to trust that solutions will start to arise. If we have patience and trust that life is trying to grow us, and that there aren't problems or that things are not going wrong, but that there's change and growth, and that in the process of the change and growth, new solutions, new answers to questions can start to come into our lives. I remember a few weeks ago, my father, who's here, spoke about the creative process, and every time that in the advertising business he has a creative problem to solve, there's tremendous anxiety, because you never know if you're going to have that great idea, but always it's about trusting that aha moment, that great idea will come, and that inevitably sometimes it doesn't come on time, and sometimes it doesn't come without a little concern, but inevitably, if you trust and allow, the great idea will come, the great solution will come. And from that, change really occurs in our lives. And so we start to go back to one of the real core themes of this work, is that life is a healing journey. And that as we walk through our lives, we allow life to change us. We say yes to what happens. We try to avoid the judgments and the pictures that we have about the way we want things to be, and what we do or don't want in our lives, and what we will or won't allow into our lives. And as we start to say yes and trust and allow, the energy of our life starts to trigger some of this old pain that we've talked about throughout these talks, the samskaras, or what the Buddhists call it, Eckhart Tolle calls it the pain body, which is all about this repressed energy in our bodies from unfelt feelings, unfelt energy patterns that have not completed themselves, that we've not allowed through, that we've repressed for whatever reason out of defense or fear, because it was too much for us at the time. And so these energy patterns are living in our body, and they are attracting experiences that are of a like vibration. We talked about vibrational frequency, and about the perfection of that we will attract things into our lives that are designed to be a perfect match to our vibration, to what we're emitting and our frequency into the universe. And so if we're holding on to an old fear or an old belief that has a vibration to it, life is going to keep attracting situations to help us let it come up and allow it and start to feel it. And so what we can do is we have a choice. We can either let ourselves fully experience these feelings that perhaps we hadn't experienced in our lives, that maybe very old, maybe from childhood, many of them are, or we can push them back down and resist and call these challenges mistakes or problems, avoid letting them really affect us and change us, avoid really trusting that it's for our own good, and then the unfinished energy patterns remain in our bodies. They don't get triggered and released, and then we just keep attracting the same kinds of experiences, the same kinds of relationships, the same kinds of people in our lives, because life wants to trigger us, because life is going to keep bringing us a mental equivalent, is what Ernest Holmes, a great teacher, calls it, for what we are holding. And that's a little bit also about the law of attraction. And so if we can start to see our lives as a healing journey, and those are the eyes of wholeness, that we can start to trust that what's happening to us, like my teacher August used to say, is happening for us. But I wanted to get now deeper into the stories and talk a little bit about what the stories are and the roles that we play in our lives, the roles that the story plays in keeping us in a box and keeping us limited and small. So some of the stories we talked about over the last few weeks were from this book called The Big Leap, and it was about various ways that we hold ourselves back and that we have limiting beliefs that stop us from self-actualizing. And Gay Hendricks is the name of the author and a great psychologist. So he talks about 4 areas of stories. And the first area is that I'm fundamentally flawed, that there's something wrong with me, and therefore if there's something wrong with me, then I can't achieve or be or have what I want in life. And that's, the notion in psychology, it's called shame or toxic shame, that there's essentially something wrong with me. And so what he talks about in the book is that how that triggers us to kind of squash our joy and squash our growth once we come up with some sort of an experience that triggers this old belief. And so I want to get in a little bit to the role that stories play in our lives and why the stories come about. So these stories that we create are really a coping mechanism. They're a defense and protection mechanism to protect us from feeling the feelings that our life brings up in us. So for example, with this story that there's something wrong with me, I'm fundamentally flawed, oftentimes that will arise from childhood if a child, for whatever reason, is not getting the love that they need. If one of the parent is not there, if they've been abandoned, if they're emotionally unavailable, physically unavailable, any kind of abuse, any sort of not giving full amount of love and attention to a child, it is too overwhelming, number one, for a child to feel those feelings completely. So what happens is, because it's so overwhelming in the body, and we've talked a lot about the emotional body, it becomes a routine or habit to start creating thoughts about the feelings that are too uncomfortable to feel. And the thoughts are all about explaining, why is this happening to me, and how can I make sense about this in a way that I don't have to feel the overwhelming feeling that this brings up in me. For a child, maybe deep sadness or loneliness or real fear or terror. And so we create a story to make sense of the world, and then that story winds up locking that energy in place. So the stories that we create, are really mental bindings that we place on the energy. And that is how these samskaras or energy patterns that are unfinished remain in our bodies. And so for this child, for example, it's too overwhelming to think that, number one, stuff happens and the universe is not justifiable and it doesn't always go the way you want it to go. That's too much for a child to even contemplate. That's too terrifying. And another thing that's really much too terrifying for a child to contemplate is that their parents are flawed. right? It's not conceivable to a child to have that sort of witness consciousness, which we've talked about a lot, about their parents when they are so much in need to be taken care of. And so the parents really need to be looked at as gods, as perfect, right? So therefore, if I'm not getting the love or the attention, or if somebody's not there for me in any way, it must be my fault. I must have done something wrong, right? So that's the story. So the story develops that I'm fundamentally flawed so that I can justify why I'm not getting what I need from my parents, or why my father left when I was 2, or my mother, did X, Y, or Z, and I wasn't getting the love that I needed. And so we create these stories, and then these stories live with us in the energy patterns of our bodies. And then what happens is, as our lives unfold, we are so protective of these soft spots and these vulnerable spots in our bodies that are based on this really deep old pain that we never really let ourselves feel, that we start to create our lives around making these stories true and protecting ourselves from having to allow life to trigger the pain underneath that story. So for example, from children, if there is a child who has not gotten the love and that there's something wrong with them, a great example about how a grown-up will continue to make that story true is to avoid real intimacy, right? Because it's overwhelming to have a longing and an intimacy that doesn't work, and to have and to try to connect with someone, and then that loss that could occur if it doesn't work out seems so terrifying, because it would bring up that old feeling of childhood, of not getting the love that the child needed, that it's safer to believe that I'm fundamentally flawed, I'm not lovable, and therefore I can't have a deep, intimate relationship, because just like there was something wrong with me that justified my parents not loving me the way I needed to be loved, there's something wrong with me that justifies a partner not loving me the way I needed to be loved. And so that's just one of many, many, many examples of how these stories are created in our childhood, and then these stories become the stories of our lives. They become the limiting stories of our lives. And we are so careful as we grow and move in our lives to not challenge these unconscious stories. And that's the key, that the stories are unconscious. Once we bring them into consciousness, then they no longer have a hold over us. But they are unconscious, and we unconsciously avoid coming anywhere near any situation that will trigger this old pain underneath the stories. So then we live a life of not having intimacy, for example. There's a few more of these classic kind of stories. One of them is that I can't outshine another person in my life, and we talked a little bit about that they need to be the star and I can't really fully shine. Or there's another one that says I will be disloyal to my clan, my family, if I succeed more than them, and that manifests oftentimes in financial success or even in relationship success. I can't have a great marriage. I can't make more money than my parents if they didn't have these things, right? Or my clan or people in my family. And then another story is that I'll be a burden. If I was a burden as when I was a child, and if I'm more successful and more actualized, then I'll be more of a burden than I was. And there's lots of different permutations of these stories. There's a great teacher, Panache Desai, he talks about, and I've used this phrase many times, it's, there's something wrong with me, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable. And so these are the stories that we create, extensions of these stories, and as I described before, they start to become real in our lives, and they start to become self-fulfilling prophecies. And as we go a little bit deeper, there are other ways of discovering what our stories are. And one of the things that I have done with my teacher, and I have done with people who have come to me, is inner child work. And without getting into, we're not going to really do it here, but I just want to describe a little bit about what that's about, because that is a fantastic and vital and wonderful way of really connecting to and discovering what your stories are, and connecting to these lost elements of yourself, of who you are, and bringing through not only the unconscious negative stories, but also the unconscious gifts. John Bradshaw is a great teacher of inner child work as well. So one of the things that I did with my teacher August, and that I have done with clients of mine, is to do a journey and a guided meditation to go and visit the inner child. And I was doing a lot of work around this for about 6 months, about 3 years ago. And I won't go through the whole thing, but it's very interesting. And a guided meditation is, when you're closing your eyes and we go through the deep breathing and you get centered. And what this meditation, it was about walking down a long stairway. And as you walk down a long stairway, that you feel really that you're entering this past place in your life. And then as you continue to walk down the stairway, you start to see a door. And then you think about and you feel what's going on the other side of that door, and you share that. And then once you open that door and you prepare yourself to open that door, amazingly, this child is there. And the child has a gift for you, and the child has a message for you. And so one of the things that came up for me when I was doing this work was around, my parents' divorce, which was in my childhood, something that created a lot of stories and a lot of trauma for me. And so I went and visited this little boy, and oftentimes, what August talks about is that we've made some sort of a commitment from that always begins with from now on. And this commitment comes from this story of what went wrong in our lives, whatever it was, and how I'll never let this happen again. And so my story, my commitment was, from now on, I'll never let things fall apart again. Right? And I've shared this in my groups on Monday nights. And because the idea was, as a child, it's not possible to really understand or accept that parents or may not be right for each other, or that a divorce is not maybe necessarily even a negative thing, but just a growth, which I got to much later, or that parents are flawed, or that sometimes things just don't work out, and excuse my language, shit happens, right? And so a child needs to understand, just like I was saying, we need to make it understandable why something that is so painful would happen. So the most common one with inner child work is that it's my fault. So I let this happen, right? I let things fall apart. I wasn't a good enough boy. So these are my beliefs, and none of these were conscious, and none of these were instilled by my parents. But this is my working out. This is really scary. I can't feel all these feelings. These feelings are too overwhelming. It's too sad. It's too much. So I'm going to create a story, and so one of the things that came out of that is I'm going to be the best little boy I can be, and I'm going to get straight A's, and I'm going to be a good, well-behaved, and I'm going to always do, the absolute best. And at that time, when we talked about it, there was a little gap of time before we talked about it, and it actually happened. And during that time, I was like a do-gooding machine, right? I was going to hold it all together. I wasn't going to let this happen, and it was all on me, right? And I think this is very common for children, and many children who are not going through divorce. There's some other stuff that happens in life, but we create that story. So my story was, from now on, I'll never let things fall apart again. And so how that manifested in my life was that, there's really only one way to assure that things don't fall apart, and that's to not really commit to many things, and to not really build many things, and to not really... So the only way to assure, one of my goals was to never get divorced. Well, one way of making sure you never get divorced is to never get married, right? One way to make sure that you're business is never going to fail, or that you're never going to have messiness in your life, is to keep it very small. And so I've shared here how for a lot of my life, this from now on I'll never let things fall apart again manifested as keeping my life small. And this is really the crux of what we're here to address today. So how are your stories keeping your life small, and how are they based on these false assumptions that you created when you were a child that really have that are not true? And how can we start to reframe some of these beliefs, these stories, these commitments that we made? So on the topic of reframing, there is a wonderful teacher named Colin Tipping, and he talks about the concept of radical forgiveness. And essentially, radical forgiveness is very much in line with everything I've said over these past weeks, in the sense of how can we reframe this experience, this thing that happened, this trauma, this memory, to see what the gift was, to see how it was for us, not didn't happen to us, how it was the energy of our becoming, how it was the energy of our self-actualization, and how, despite the fact that it was painful, that it was actually not something to be judged as wrong, but rather something to be trusted as for us, and that there was some growth on the other side of it. So after doing a lot of work about, from now on, I'll never let things fall apart again, it occurred to me on one day that I'll never forget, that was very life-changing, that my parents' divorce wasn't something falling apart, but that it was a cracking open and a liberation for all of us. That the construct of the marriage and the way our home was constructed was too tight. And August talks a lot about needing a bigger pot, that we outgrow the pot we're in if we're like plants, and that we need to move into a bigger pot where we can grow. And that for whatever reason, this lasted as long as it could last, but that for not just my parents' self-actualization, but for my own, it needed to be released so that we could grow out of it. We needed a bigger pot collectively. And so that's a way of, and there's a lot more to process the feelings underneath that, but that conceptual shift and reframing was tremendous for me for my healing. Because the one thing that went wrong, so-called, in my life, that I could always name as being the problem or the thing that set me from being and doing or trusting love or getting married or being in partnership or whatever it was that I thought was wrong, is no longer wrong. Right? Now it makes sense. And so all of the energy needed to be released from that. So I needed to have some real sadness about, so what that means that, letting go about some of this energy that I've been holding on to, but it's a total liberation. And so this radical forgiveness is how do we look at these stories that we've constructed that are making us small and that are keeping us in this box, and how do we liberate ourselves from the box? How do we liberate ourselves and start to become, what we talk about as masters of our own destiny instead of victims of our fate, right? And, the whole notion of fate really comes from this idea that fate is really what happens to us when we are unconscious of our motives and our stories. So it is possible to live life not as a healing journey. It is possible to not learn the lessons, to not reframe. And so if we don't learn the lessons and we don't reframe, then we do have a form of fate. And the fate is that we're victims of these energy patterns living in our bodies. We refuse to allow our life to trigger them so that we really feel them fully and release them from our body. Therefore, they still maintain themselves as a point of attraction for us. Therefore, there is a level of we're going to keep attracting the same things, and that's really what fate is. Fate is that we're not letting life heal us. We're resisting. We're making it wrong. we're not going there is a great way of talking about it. So we let our stories tell the story of our life. We're not good at this. We're not lovable. We can't make a lot of money doing what we love. We can't have true partnership and intimacy. We'll never have enough abundance. All of these things that we're not even necessarily conscious of, but they start to create this. In the book Untethered Soul, Michael Singer talks about this. It's brilliant. It's like this device it's like this contraption that we build around us to avoid getting hurt. And it's almost like this whole. It's like this orb of protective mechanism. And so we walk through our lives making sure that nothing triggers the stories and keeping ourselves safe so we don't have to feel vulnerability about going into true partnership and feeling the feelings of having been abandoned or maybe being abandoned, of feeling so vulnerable that, wow, I finally have to feel these feelings about my parents' divorce now that I'm in a marriage and my marriage is triggering these feelings of loss or pain or sadness. So I'm just going to stay away from that. And whatever else your story is, in any area of life, it can be relationships, it can be work. I don't want to trigger the feelings of I'm not good enough in my job, so I'm never really going to go for what I love. I'm just going to play it safe, make a decent living, pay the bills, keep myself small. Because if I really go for what I love, then that's vulnerable and it might trigger my I'm not good enough feelings. And so we start to create these safe lives, and as I had said in several talks, for me it was a small business, no partnership, living on my own. And then what happened was I started to grow and say yes, and then my business grew exponentially, and I took on a partner and working on family planning, and now it's completely chaotic and out of control, and it's triggering lots of feelings. And so the energy of resistance, a lot of our stories are based on the energy of resistance. That I don't want to feel these feelings, so I want to stop the flow of change in my life. And that's how we get stuck, and that's how our lives turn from having an open and self-actualized destiny, which is open-ended, which is based on us fulfilling our gifts, and that's how they change to this faded life of keeping ourselves small and keeping ourselves within a box and keeping ourselves within the safe confines of our fears and our stories. And so how can we start to shift and at least have some awareness and start to have awareness of when we are living our lives, allowing our stories of smallness and fear to keep us from expanding and getting larger. And when we start to discover our stories, how can we start to reframe them and start to have some forgiveness for them and start to see them in a new light that liberates us and start to live our lives in a way that we're saying yes to the change that's happening. One of the things I learned, which was amazing in some classes I took recently on business, was that the rate of change is the single most differentiating fact of our current time in business and in the world. The biggest difference between now and 50, 100, 2,000 years ago is the rate of change in our lives. And so if I have beliefs and stories that are all based on resisting change, now more than ever, that will be so painful to live a life that way. And also, that will keep our lives from changing. And so how do we say yes to the change that wants to happen? Start to see the challenges as this energy of becoming, as this energy of self-actualization, as this healing journey that we're going through, and say yes to them and allow this energy that wants to come into our body and trigger us to move through us so that we can release these old feelings, release these old beliefs and these stories, and remembering that the stories are holding the energy in our bodies. And so as we gain consciousness of these stories, already they start to release from our bodies, and therefore they release their hold over us. And so we move from this faded box of a life into much more a life of open-ended possibility and self-actualization and the fulfillment of our potential, and sitting in a place where we can really be made new, which is a biblical term, and put this past of these limits and fears behind us and step into the present moment and really start to see the potential of this moment and to start to say yes to everything coming into our lives with a fresh feeling of a new beginning.